Well, hello everyone, and welcome to a new episode of the Tintin and Hergé podcast. And it's been a while since I began this podcast, but this is the first episode of the podcast that will be recorded in English, since most of the uh, previous episodes were in Spanish. And the reason for this is that we have a very special guest, someone who for several years has been hosting the podcast Radio Tintin, on which he discusses all things Tintin and Hergé and does so with knowledge and rigor and passion. He is joining us today from his home in Melbourne, Victoria, over in Australia. And in a way, that means he's joining us from the future because it is Thursday morning over there, while it is still Wednesday afternoon here in Tennessee. And it's a pleasure to have on the show today Alex Gates. Alex, thank you for being here and welcome to Tintin and Hergé.
You're very welcome, Anton. Thank you for having me on. I can confirm the future is quite bright. So lots to look forward to in your part of the world.
Now, one thing that I found interesting about your podcast is that there aren't a lot of podcasts about Tintin in English. I think there's one in Canada, and maybe there are a couple others elsewhere. But yours is very detailed and very interesting, and it shows your passion for Tintin. And so I was wondering, when and how did you first encounter the adventures of Tintin?
Yeah, it's something I've certainly only really come to understand since I've been hosting the podcast is that discrepancy between essentially there's a big gap in the English market for appreciation of Tintin. So for my personal story, for example, and it seems to mirror those fellow English speakers who enjoy Tintin, you get introduced to it by someone from a previous generation. So I'm one of four brothers. So one of my brothers got a Tintin book for Christmas, and read that, and he really got into Tintin. He was a couple of years younger than me, and I think I began to engage with it through osmosis, quite ironically, because I was this teenager or something, and there's this little redhead kid with weird shorts going on these adventures, very sort of quaint and wholesome. So I think initially I sort of kept my ironic distance because I didn't think it was very cool. But the more I sort of engaged with it, the more I began to appreciate it on face value. And then when it came to the pandemic, where we're all stuck at home, and I was desperate for things to do, and I thought, I'd really like to buy every Tintin book in like hardcover format and read them. And then I thought, well, if I'm going to read them start to finish, I should catalog it and record it in some way. And then I thought, well, if I'm cataloging it and recording it, I should put in the time to like research the history behind each album.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how it began. Back in 2020 during lockdown. You say it's a podcast. I guess it technically is a podcast because it's in audio format. But I guess that implies a sense of consistency that I don't really have with the podcast. I guess I've started thinking it was more of like a ongoing thesis. I will eventually analyze every single Tintin album, and I'm just sort of putting that out in installments. So there's not a big output, but I think that is the downside of or the inevitability of working full time, and also wanting to ensure that these albums are sort of analyzed properly, not just putting something out for the sake of it. But there's so much work put into these albums originally. I want to take the time to research them. But certainly, it's come to my, just anecdotally from the people that follow me, it's not a big portion of English language speakers. Big, Spanish language, so lots of people in South America, Europe, obviously, and, all over Asia, but not a lot of Australians, not a lot of Americans, some English, but not that many. So it's certainly something I've noticed as well.
So it seems like Tintin in Australia is a little bit like here in the United States. He doesn't have the presence that it does have in other parts of the world. Would you say that's the case in Australia as well? And if so, why do you think that is?
Yeah, that's certainly what I would have noted, what I would say about it in Australia. I don't know if it's the same in in the United States, but we do in bookstores. There's often a Tintin rocket display with sort of the albums on it, and that's a pretty unique thing. Like that is in most bookshops, so it's got like a pride of place there. But there just isn't the cultural awareness of Tintin. It's not something that you just grow up reading as a kid, as I imagine is the case in many of those places I mentioned. In terms of why that is, I'm not prepared to speculate why I don't think it's gone into the English market. But I would say it might have something to do with there's such a different comic book tradition in the West. It is very much that superhero comic tradition, and that's been there a lot stronger. So when people think of comics, that's sort of what comes to mind. Whereas obviously in the Franco-Belgian comic tradition, it's a completely different beast. It's a sort of a separate genre entirely. But it's certainly something that I've noticed in Australia.
And it's too bad because, I speak French and the English translation is outstanding. It's a really good translation. The translators have really done a fantastic job. And I think that in a way that should help to introduce a character that's in a way a foreign character from a, different, written originally in a different language and published in a different tradition, but somehow it hasn't happened. And I think you're right about the fact that, for example, at least here in the United States, there is such a huge amount of homegrown product as far as the comic books are concerned, that it's almost as though, even though Hergé tried hard during his lifetime, it's almost like there isn't really much of a market share left for Tintin and the Belgian comic books. So that could be part of the
Well,
reason.
absolutely. And, I don't know if it's something to do with more cynicism on the reading public, but, if you've got, and this is an insult to English, I'm a big Batman, Superman, Spider-Man fan as well. But, if you've got a choice, you're 10 years old and you've got a choice between, a gritty and dark Batman story that looks really cool. And again, this really sort of strange, quaint boy with these bright colors, in these strange worlds. It might not grab you initially. Maybe there is that, in the same way that I was a bit anxious to engage with it genuinely when I was a teenager, because it did seem a bit corny, a bit too wholesome for me. And I realize the error of my ways now, but maybe that is something to do with it. Whereas, for whatever reason, readers in other markets are more than happy to just engage with things as they are and just appreciate them for what they are. That's potentially one reason.
What changed for you though, Alex? What made you you mentioned the pandemic, but what was it about the books that kind of, grabbed your attention all of a sudden and made you, want to dive into the the entire series of comic books of Tintin?
I think probably two things. Probably, as I mentioned before, I got more mature, and ironically, you get more mature and you can appreciate things that are made for kids more. I got more mature, and I wasn't afraid to engage with something that might seem initially corny and wholesome for what it is. I guess I lost that insecurity, but also I got a lot more into, I guess, creativity. Doing my own things. I've always been someone who has done podcasts and videos and my own stories and things like that. So certainly the artistic process I began to understand and appreciate a bit more. And there was this body of work that was both long running, it goes for 50 years, but then limited. It doesn't continue after that. So you've got this big chunk of works over 50 years by essentially mostly just one guy. You get to see, how his worldview evolves, and also the world that he's representing, how that evolves over time. You've got such a good, sample size of something to look at. And it is just the product of one person, essentially. So I really began to appreciate it in sort of through that artistic process, and the work that went into creating them, and also how that changed over time, how his characters changed, how his worldview changed through that. I just found it very, very interesting to look at as one whole, set of works. I appreciate it in that sense.
In many ways, I think one of the interesting things about Tintin is the fact that you can really study the history of the Western world, and not just the Western world, but throughout the 20th century by looking at the way in which Hergé treated some of these, conflicts and events in history between, the late 1920s all the way up to the 1970s. Does that aspect of history in any way interest you?
Oh yes, absolutely. I'm a big amateur history buff, particularly 19th and 20th century. And I can't remember who said the quote, and I'm probably misattributing, but it's like Tintin is a history of the 20th century,
Hmm.
and yeah, it's fascinating to see those different events reflected. Even looking at a character like and this is such a minor one, but looking at a character like General Alcazar
Hmm.
and the way he's dressed in his first adventure, he's wearing the very traditional military outfit with the saber. In his final appearance, he's wearing the camouflage combat fatigues with the assault rifle. It's the
Hmm.
same character, but what it meant to be I guess, a military leader in South America in that sense has changed. In the course of him writing those adventures. But everything from the Japanese invasion of China, explored in the Blue Lotus, a very real world event, to I guess more cultural phenomenons, the the paparazzi and the print press in something like the Castafiore Emerald. Like, these cultural and historical phenomena are explored with such humor,
Hmm.
um, and such adventure, and through a character that you know and love. It's such a fascinating insight into many different aspects of history. I think that's a fantastic aspect of the whole series.
Yeah, and sometimes he does that also through, imaginary lands that he created, like Saldavian, Borduria, and San Theodorus and all that. But he actually repurposes those imaginary countries depending on the historical moment that we're talking about. It could be World War II in King Ottokar's scepter. It could be, the space race later in the Moon albums, and then it's the Cold War and in the Calculus Affair. So I think Hergé had kind of a knack for that kind of thing. It's not only what he talks about regarding history, but also what he does not talk about regarding history, because there were some important conflicts in the 20th century, like the Korean War or Vietnam, for example, and he doesn't talk about those. And so we could sometimes think about, why is he concentrating on certain events but not on others? So, you know,
Absolutely. I mean, and having just finished, sort of the period covering the period during the Second World War,
mhm.
and the books written in that one, and certainly the way in which a fascist movement is depicted as antagonistic prior to the war,
Yeah,
but during occupation, there's no overt politics, which was, as I've explored, a very, very deliberate way to sort of stay under the
certain
censor's
kind of
radar.
escapism. Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, exactly. Moving towards those exotic adventures away from the grim realities of living in occupied Europe. Yeah, and I think that's so interesting. You're quite right. What is covered, the space race, but what isn't covered, Vietnam and Korea. It's yeah, it's fascinating.
Now, you did mention that the pandemic had a lot to do with your interest in Tintin and delving into the series, and I suppose it also had quite a bit to do with your project of Radio Tintin. You mentioned that you wanted to somehow in an audio and audio visual in some ways too, because this is also accompanied by blog posts, where you have text and you have illustrations and that kind of thing. But there's the audio component of that, which is, where that's what I would describe more as a podcast, and I did before. But is your intention with Radio Tintin to simply chronicle your reading, or is there anything else that you want to do with this podcast, slash chronicle of your experience with Tintin?
I suppose look, primarily it was for me, in that these were books that I was familiar with, and I'd read them. Some I'd read a lot, some I'd only glanced through once, but I'd never done a full read.
Mm.
So a lot of it was a personal reflection on what do I, as an individual, get reading this particular story, or all of these stories in order. And that's been really an unexpectedly enjoyable aspect of the project, is remembering how good these albums are on a personal level. Just sitting there and reading it and enjoying it. Particularly ones, there were ones that I overlooked or didn't reread for one reason or another. And going back, I'm like, wow, it is almost like reading them for the first time. And because I got the appreciation, I can, and I'm mature enough, I can sit back and go, wow, this is actually just like a fantastic adventure to read. So there is that personal aspect. But a lot of it is just to when it's completed, and look, will it ever be completed? And I don't know. There's a lot of things to talk about. I don't just do the albums. I like to explore the different related things in the Hergé world. So there's potential lots of different bonus episodes I could look through. But if it is ever done, I want to be able to say, okay, I've provided that. I provided a historical and social context for all of those albums. Now, whether or not that's an accurate one, lots of people will reach different conclusions about what's being said and what's being trying to be explored in those albums, and that's fine. But I will have provided that social and historical context for every single album. I just think it's worth. I think it's worth it. The work deserves that kind of analysis. And the fact that it's not really that popular of a subject in the English language just makes it all the more important to do, I think. But yeah, certainly no rush to do it, as you can probably tell by my output. But yeah, it's exciting to think of providing that analysis of the series as a whole.
When I began my series of videos about Tintin several years ago, Spanish language videos, I did it because I was bored, one cold January afternoon at my in-laws in North Carolina. And but then, there was a certain response from people who enjoyed the videos, and I started feeling a certain kind of pressure to do more and to delve deeper and to read secondary works and stuff like that. When I hear your audios, when I listen to them, I see that there's a lot of work and preparation behind what you do. Could you walk us a little bit through the process, what you do to prepare these episodes?
Yeah, so it will typically start with just reading the album, and just recording my initial thoughts of that. So no secondary sources or anything. My initial feelings of it, what parts I liked, etc. Then I guess we go to the secondary resources. So I'll consult the available Hergé biographies available in English. That is one thing to note. To note, if I was fortunate enough to speak French, the wealth of information would open dramatically. So, not only am I, speaking to an English language, but I'm reliant on English translations as well. So I'll consult particularly the biographies of Hergé that are available in English. And there's some really good ones, and they don't just cover the same information. So it's really good to get that cross-reference and sort of understand, okay, what was going on with Hergé's life, at the time of writing. What personal or professional factors were at play that might then influence the end result of the album he was making. And then I'll also do that with looking at, there's fortunately there's no shortage of I guess supplementary material about Hergé's art in particular, looking at the the different processes that went into his particular artworks, what images he had in his archive that inspired particular parts of the novel, and so I'll get all that information and I'll usually reread it, the actual album itself, a couple of times and just slowly begin to put all these pieces together, looking at the whole story, looking at the album, and then looking at the real world information and trying to slot that in there. And then, if I will usually look at the different adaptations of that particular album. There's been a couple of Tintin TV series, a couple of animated movies. Look at how those adaptations translate the original material as well. It's very much it's a big blob of information. It's a big lump of clay of information. I just sort of stick in there and then begin to sort of work out until I feel like I've got an idea of the process that went into making the album.
For somebody who is familiar with the Tintin albums and would like to kind of delve deeper and read some secondary works, there are translated, there are available in English. Do you have any favorites among those?
Yeah, certainly. So look, in terms of biographies, I've actually bought them here. Pierre Assolini, Herge, the man who created Tintin, and Benoit Peters, Hergé, son of Tintin, are really, really good biographies. In terms of analysis of his artwork, there's plenty of books by Philippe Godin and Michael Farr in English. You'll find their names attached to a lot of supplementary Tintin material. Only thing to be wary of is they are, I guess, what you call approved, Tintinologists. So they work in collaboration with the estate, which is fine. That means they've got access to a variety of materials, particularly visual materials. But there may be a slight tendency to maybe overlook some of the more troubling aspects, or it's presenting the company line about Hergé, if you will, which is not to say I think I've explored what controversies there are about Hergé. I think I've explored them pretty fairly and fairly openly. There's not nothing that people aren't necessarily aware of, but just be conscious that this is presenting the company line. But certainly, I use a lot of Michael Farr and Philippe Godin as well. Particularly with the art books, it's fascinating to get a look at that process. Hergé kept a very extensive physical archive of things that inspired him. Magazine clippings, newspapers, pictures, postcards. Of things that he thought were visually worth, preserving. And it's great to see those original artifacts and how they come into the stories as well. But particularly for biographies, Pierre Assolini and Benoit Peters can't go wrong. They're really I don't know what I'd do in the podcast if I didn't have those terrific biographies.
I totally agree. And when you mentioned Michael Farr, there's his Complete Companion, which is, a really, really good book and really well illustrated with lots of pictures and, from the archives and all that. I've always found it very interesting and really too bad that the series of Entretiens avec Hergé, the conversations with Hergé that Numa Sadoul did in the 1970s, those were never translated into English. They're translated into Spanish and Catalan of all languages, but not into Dutch or German or English. It's very surprising. It kind of gives you an idea of the scarce interest that there seems to be in Hergé in the English speaking world.
Yeah, I know the interviews you're referring to. Fortunately, there is a sort of a DVD release that explores those, which is great. The documentary is very, very interesting. But you're right, to have those, that would be a fantastic resource to have Hergé's words. I've got a very small, again, officially licensed, officially approved Hergé in his own book of Hergé quotes, and it's better than nothing. But compared to, I'd love to have that those full interview transcripts. I think it'd be terrific. But yeah, I can't. Catalan, as you said, there's a Catalan market, but there's not an English market for it. I wish that was available.
Yeah. Well, when we talk a little bit about, the world of Tintin and the universe of characters and situations and plots that Hergé created over, the better part of 50 plus years, I was wondering, you besides Tintin, are there any characters that you particularly feel close to, or that you feel a certain bond with, or that you, for whatever reason, are specifically interested in?
In terms of the world he's created, I think it's always a double act with Captain Haddock and
Mm.
whoever is causing him like grief at that particular moment. Whether that's Calculus being deaf, or Lady Castafiore being a diva, or Jolene Wag being completely oblivious. It's very sort of basic comedy, but because it's basic, it works so well. You have a uptight character, and you have him engage with someone who is a polar opposite in some way. Um, so it's always very, very entertaining, and seeing how he employs that use of humor,
Mhm.
particularly at moments of great tension. It's, again, this is part of appreciating that creative process, and you know thinking myself, wow, would I have the creative instinct to do what he's done here,
Mm.
of having these moments of great tension, like perfectly broken up with like slapstick, and he gets pacing um, so good. And you see that evolution again from the
Mm.
maybe the early couple, where it's very fast paced, slapdash, event. He gets so good at balancing that tension with moments of humor, and quite often that is with Captain Haddock and whoever's annoying him at that stage. So I think I'd probably have to say, yeah, Captain Haddock serves such an important purpose in terms of that, and but it's part of the whole cast of characters, and how he utilizes them so well.
I kind of feel like, maybe it shows my age a little bit, but I feel like when I was a kid, of course, I was much more in line with Tintin and a lot more attracted by that kind of position of the hero that he has, in the stories. But I think the older I get, I think I feel closer to Captain Haddock in some ways, personality wise, maybe, or as his kind of worldview is a little bit more appealing as you grow older, I feel like.
Oh, he's certainly much more, he might say realistic. You could also say cynical, but I think that was something for Hergé as well. He certainly, started when he was 20 or something, relating to Tintin. Essentially just a Boy Scout like he was. But then, you become Captain Haddock over time. You become more grumpy, you become more cynical, and maybe a bit less willing to tolerate fools. So yeah, I think I suppose we've got to strive to maintain a little bit of both.
Absolutely. Now, it is also true, I think, that the world has changed a great deal since the time that these books have been published, which might make it a little bit more difficult in some ways to get newer generations interested in the character of Tintin and the stories and that kind of thing. But do you think there's anything, Alex, that the younger generations in the 21st century, we're recording this in 2026, at the very beginning of 2026. Do you think there's something that younger people can learn from reading the Adventures of Tintin? Is there anything specifically that you think would be, I don't know, attractive to younger generation readers who, are used to a different type of entertainment and a different, just a different world that they've been born into?
That's a really good question, because the world in Tintin's adventures, it doesn't look like the world that young people face today. Um, and you know, I think potentially there is that risk of that generational loss. But I think, and Tintin was written for children.
Mhm.
Initially, it was a children's adventure story, um, and I think any piece of art, if it's good enough, it will remain good enough. I guess the best example is like the Pixar films. They're for kids, but they're fantastic. They're so fantastic that anyone can enjoy them, and kids of any age, like in any generation, I think will still love Toy Story or The Incredibles because they're just so well made.
Mhm.
So I think that there's that quality of the stories will stand up over time, and I think kids are still kids, and I think there is something very appealing and very entertaining about that sense of adventure, about these pretty simple characters, but I think that makes it easier to understand and easier to appreciate. I think despite the strange outfit he's wearing and the strange places he's going to, kids can see themselves as Tintin, and they can appreciate an adventure. They can see these exotic locations and these dangers and still, because they're created so well, and still appreciate them. I think fun is still fun, and I think the Tintin adventures, above all else, are just fun. So I absolutely think despite the historical and cultural changes that have occurred since Hergé's death, they're still fantastic adventures, and they're still primarily aimed at children. So I think there's definitely something to be appreciated
Yeah, and
for
like
kids of all ages.
I think like all good, children's literature and young adults literature, what happens with Tintin, and this happens also with, I don't know, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll, or the books of Roald Dahl, for example. I think there's a certain kind of difference in reading levels. Like a kid can read the story for the adventure and the excitement and the graphics and all that, whereas an adult can just delve deeper and just read more into it because there's different levels of reading and interpretation. And I think that's one of the things that makes, I don't know, the comic books of Hergé, just like some other works that I've mentioned, really really attractive and kind of timeless in a way. It's that, depending on how old you are, you can read it at a different level.
Absolutely, like a child may not, appreciate that, the villains in Ottokar's Scepter are, a fascist, fourth column movement or something. That's going to go clearly over their head. They're just going to want to see Tintin, best the bad guys. But you're quite right. An adult reading that can maybe make those historical connections. And again, that's a comparison with again, to use the Pixar films, for example. Like, kids are going to love the characters and the fun they have, but there's jokes there that only adults will understand and appreciate. And I think, yeah, I think good, even if it's aimed at children, good art is enjoyable at all ages. I think that definitely applies to Tintin.
And you mentioned, some of the adaptations of Tintin that have been done over the years. What is your opinion about those adaptations? From the animated series from the 1990s to the Steven Spielberg movie from several years. I was going to say a few years back, but it's actually quite a few
Yeah.
years back now. How do you feel? Is Tintin? Do you feel like Tintin is easy to adapt to a medium like cinema, or maybe not so much?
It's such an interesting question, because so much of the appeal is the visuals,
Mm,
is Hergé's fantastic art that he's made. Um, that is central to the appreciation of those adventures. So having said that, anything that moves away from the page is going to lose something.
mhm,
Now, having said that, the I I really enjoy the 1990s series. It's a very, very faithful adaptation. Again, is it as beautiful as these pages? No, but you do get, I think, certainly a sense of adventure. It's not. It's it's very faithful adaptation, so it's certainly something to be enjoyed. I certainly enjoy those as well. Probably, again, there is sort of another sense of maybe a bit of ironic enjoyment of them. It can come across as a little bit corny, a little bit cheesy, but they are faithful adaptations. I really appreciate that, and as I do appreciate the Steven Spielberg film adaptation, not I think that is somewhat of a controversial film for Tintin diehards. Because it does make some changes. It does make some slight changes to characterization. Obviously, visually, it's very different. But at the same time, there was so much love and appreciation for the comics that I think comes through in the adaptation. Originally, Hergé was scheduled to meet with a very young Steven Spielberg in the early 80s to discuss an adaptation of the films. Hergé died before that could take place, but I think it's fantastic that Spielberg was eventually able to make that film. Peter Jackson, obviously, also a huge Tintin fan. I really, really enjoy that adaptation. I think you've got to accept the market realities of the market you're in, and there has to be some changes by necessity. You can't be a complete purist about it if you want it to be enjoyed by multiple people and make money. You've got to find a balance between respecting the original vision and making your own necessary changes. I think that was done in a very respectful way. I have a lot of time for that Steven Spielberg film. I really enjoy it.
And I agree. And I remember I went out to see it here in Tennessee when it came out with my wife. And, originally, I must say that I wasn't over the moon about it when I came out of the cinema that day. But it's a movie that has grown on me over the years, and I feel like technically it's wonderful and it has a lot of good things about it. And I think whereas at first I didn't like it as much, the more I watch it, the more I like it. And I think that kind of speaks to a little bit of what you were saying just now.
Yeah, as I said, it's hard when you have such reverence for any source material to
Mm.
see it adapted. You're always going to be skeptical and sort of compare it unfavorably. As I said, nothing can Tintin is the comic books. That is Tintin in its purest form. Nothing will match that experience. But I think with anything, if there's love and respect for it, you can usually adapt it in a respectful way.
Do you have any hope for any more films in that same manner or not? Because it looks like it's been a long time already, like 12, 13 years since that movie came out. And it doesn't look like there's going to be any more in that same fashion.
No, and look, they always say when they're asked about it, they always say, "Oh no, it's not dead yet. It's dead." Like it it if it set the world on fire and it was a huge box office smash, and
Mhm.
it did well, but it didn't do
It wasn't like
gangbusters.
Lord of the Rings in that way.
No. And if it was like Lord of the Rings, they'd be saying, the studio would be saying, get us another one, get us another one, get us another
Mhm.
one. I think we've got to accept that Spielberg's getting pretty old, and Peter Jackson's not a young man anymore. They've undoubtedly got so many projects they
Mhm.
want to do. They've done this once. I don't think without the studio pressure to say make it, make it, make it, they're not going to decide to do it on their own. Which is fine. But it does lead to the question, will there be any further adaptations? I mean, eventually there's got to be, but the the Tintin Imaginatio, which is the new name of the estate, is very, as I'm sure you know, very particular about
Mhm.
their the brand and how they
They're
market the
protected,
brand. So
right? Wouldn't you say
very
they're
protected.
protected?
I would say to the point of pettiness. To be honest, they I think it's fantastic they're protecting this thing. You don't want to see it cheapened in a
Mm.
way, but also we're talking about younger generations. You've got to get those characters out there if you want the younger generation to go back and read those books. My followers, for example, on Tintin, the Tintin page, are much more likely to be people of your age, Anton, than people that Hergé was originally writing for.
Mm.
Which is fine. I'm providing obviously sort of a higher level analysis of them, but they've yeah, I think it does run the risk of they seem to want to position Tintin as almost like a purely a luxury brand or a work of art, something premium. And I think in terms of quality, it certainly is premium. But we can't lose sight of the fact that these were stories written for 10-year-olds,
Mm.
like that's what their primary purpose is. And that shouldn't be lost. And I think there is room for other adaptations that can be done faithfully, but it's going to require a change in attitude of the estate.
Yeah, I agree. And what you're saying is very interesting because it is certainly true that Tintin has been positioned more as a luxury item, but also as a museum piece almost, you know.
Yes.
And so, that becomes a problem because if it is a cultural icon, it can be a cultural icon, but if it's not available out there, then it cannot be popular in the sense of, being liked by everybody from, kids who are young to adults who grew up with it, and as far as the strategy, it just doesn't work very well. But bearing all of that in mind, Alex, how do you envision the future of Tintin? What do you think is going to happen to the character, or is there anything that you think could be done in order to kind of revamp its popularity or his popularity among, the younger generations?
Yeah, great question. And I guess a lot of that is dependent on the attitude that they take and if they want to continue to position it as you said, I think quite rightly, a museum piece. And certainly it belongs in a museum. But what happens when the people who go into those museums like die? Then who's interested in Tintin anymore? I think it is certainly worthy of that higher analysis. But as I said, it's it's started as a mass entertainment. So any sort of future, any long term future of Tintin needs to sort of recognize that. And I think there is room for, yeah, loosening the leash a little bit when it comes to use of the character. I mean, there's 20 odd stories. I mean, we've got a litany of streaming services. You can't tell me there can't be some sort of adaptation of those original stories. Whether that's with the technology we've got, you can't say we couldn't make something very very similar to Hergé's original art style in that looked particularly striking or particularly faithful. I think even thinking about the Steven Spielberg film, the opening titles and the closing titles
Mhm.
really evoked that classic style, but it still seemed modern, so that it can be done. Besides that, there's you can certainly do a live action series about that. Or you could even just use the characters and create new adventures. And that might seem sacrilege. These are stories that Hergé never wrote. That's maybe has to be a trade-off, that, or it needs to be thought considered. um, you know there's there needs to be a balance between respecting the integrity of the
Mhm.
characters and of Hergé's work, and also taking it out of the museum, I think, um, because that's no long term future. It can't be seen as something just quaint and historically significant, and that's it. Uh, and there needs to be less, protection and litigation around the use of the character. I do follow someone on Instagram who did these magnificent Tintin pictures in his own art style, so could never be confused as Hergé's work. It was definitely, this guy was using the character, and creating in his own way. Fantastic, and was informed by the estate, delete all those pictures. That's copyright infringement. What harm does having this character seen by more people do to the brand? It's nothing controversial about that. All that does is just make more people aware of this character. So again, any future needs to move away from that museum piece approach.
And I know this is really a point of contention, but would you like to see new adventures of Tintin? Because the reason why it's a point of contention is that Hergé himself said, Tintin, c'est moi, Tintin, it's me. And without me, he cannot live. But do you agree with Hergé about that? Or would you be interested in seeing what other, comic book creators, what other authors, other artists could do with the character?
It's such an interesting question, because that he was so explicit about that. And, you want to respect that. You do want to respect those wishes. I don't know what the answer is. I mean, it's certainly in comic book form. I don't know. I think maybe the time has passed for that. It's not like asterisks and obelisks where there was a continuation, and a sense of continuity after the original artist passed away. I think maybe potentially is like a special edition artist's interpretation of Tintin, as like a one-off or something. I think you'd probably be safer exploring new Tintin adventures in a medium besides the comic book, maybe a film or a TV adaptation or a video game, just because then I feel like you're not necessarily disrespecting his wishes on the matter. I feel like you can keep those original albums by Hergé as your basis. Leave those in the museum if you like, but then you can maybe use those characters, present them in a different way. But yeah, certainly I feel like, and this is someone who's just spent the last 10 minutes saying, I want new Tintin things. It would, I guess, cheapen it somewhat to have, all these albums by one guy and then like another 2, 3, 4 by someone else. It's like, well, but then again, like, I don't need to read those ones, and if those 2, 3, 4 new albums by someone else get more people interested and reading the original, I can't call that a bad thing. In answer, it's a long way of saying I'm not really sure, Anton. I want to respect, the wishes of such a creative genius, but I also want Tintin to survive into the future.
Yeah, well,
beyond just high-priced collectibles and art books.
Well, two quick things about that. You mentioned video games, and a good friend of mine who lives in the northwest of Spain, he says that video games are a very good medium to further the presence of the character of Tintin in the market, because a lot of people today who are young today actually were born into that medium, and that could be a good way to do it. I don't know if that's something you've thought about.
Absolutely. And that's a really interesting point. There was recently, about 2 years ago, an adaptation of Cigars de Pharaohs,
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Which I played some. I don't game very much, so I need to make time to do it. Yeah, I need to do it just so I've played it. But having, from what I saw, that wasn't a 1-for-1 adaptation of Cigars de Pharaohs, and that character model wasn't made by Hergé. I think that's potentially a very, very interesting idea, because you can then use those adventures as maybe the basis, but then it can move out from that. And I think I don't know. I think there's more diversity in video games in terms of the kinds of adventures, the kinds of protagonists. You know, it's not unusual to play as something weird and quirky or nonsensical in a video game. So people aren't going to be put off by playing as this quaint, reporter from the 1930s. So I think that is potentially another avenue they can explore. I think they should explore. Yeah, and again, providing it's done with love and care for the original characters and appreciation thereof, I think that's a great way to introduce the characters to new generations.
And the other thing I wanted to mention regarding that is that we during the Tintin marathon that we broadcast back in December, we had the chance to interview Numa Sadul, who did those conversations with Hergé. And
Fantastic.
yes, and he's in his late 70s, and we asked him that question. We said, what do you think the future of Tintin would be, and or should be? And he was talking about the idea of allowing artists to approach Tintin in the very francophone fashion of Tintin seen by, or Tintin as seen by this artist. And in that way, it wouldn't have to be exactly like Hergé meant it, but it could also have, the I guess the vision, and just, the style of another artist. And that would be, he thought, a very positive way of kind of furthering the presence of the character of Tintin in the market.
Absolutely, I think that's when you put it that way, it's a terrific idea. Again, coming back to this Instagram artist I was following. Not trying to copy Urge, but showing his appreciation and his interpretation of the character. I think that's certainly a way forward. But Anton, we're not paid to make those decisions.
No.
Unfortunately,
I
wish
wish.
hopefully they can listen to this and get some ideas. But unfortunately, it's not up to us ultimately.
Well, as we're winding down the conversation, Alex, I was wondering if there are any specific Tintin albums that you're particularly fond of, and if so, why?
Yeah. Now I should caveat that with I'm still going through them with fresh eyes. So in another year it might have changed, but the ones I've always gravitated to give you three, I'd say Ottokar Scepter. I just love that as an analysis of pre-war tension, politics, and just as a political thriller, I really, really enjoy that. Black Island, again, we've got those sort of political elements, but that's it's very Hitchcockian, I think, quite intentionally. Again, being the chase and the thriller. Tintin's going against a counterfeiting ring, which is sort of small. It's not world domination or anything, but I think that adds almost a grittiness to it that I think is really interesting.
And that has three different, versions.
Oh yeah, yeah. Talk about changing 20th century. Yeah, it's that's another thing. Looking at the changes over time is terrific. Particularly those two different color versions of Black Island. If you're listening, whoever's listening, if you get a chance, do read the original colored version of Black Island. Some people prefer it to the later version. I think they're both brilliant, but it's just lovely to see.
The British editor did not prefer it to the newer
version. No, he did, and that's another thing we can talk about. When is it better that Hergé interprets these foreign countries versus what he got into, which was very meticulously studying them. So I think it's just they're both worth looking at. But Black Island and again going back to that Cold War, the political theme is Calculus Affair. Just Tintin in a Cold War thriller. It's just like it's as you said, those different elements, those different trends in the 20th century come through. So I guess I've always gravitated more towards the more maybe realistic, more gritty, political ones. But I was reading just yesterday I was beginning my first read through of Prisoners of the Sun, and I'm just like, which is not really political at all, but I thought it's fantastic. And same with Secret of the Unicorn.
Mhm.
They're all they're all really good, is what I'm trying to say. But I think I'd pick those three as sort of my favorites. But the breadth of the genres available is so interesting. You've really got to read them all and sort of see what aspects you like of different ones. What about yourself, Anton? Is there any that you always go back to?
Yes, there's Calculus Affair is one of them for sure. But I've always really liked the Castafiore Emerald because it's just very different from all the others, and in the sense that the adventure actually is non-existent or kind of non-existent, and the adventure kind of comes to the castle of Marlinspike instead of them having to go somewhere else. And I just love that idea of creating a story that's actually about nothing and sustaining the interest and the suspense over, 62 pages. I think that's just absolutely amazing. And then I think just because of the way in which the Kingdom of Sildavia is created, King Ottokar's scepter to me is also a masterpiece. Not to mention what you were talking about regarding the historical context and all of that. But it's very difficult. This changes almost every month. But I wonder if you think that there are any Tintin books that are better to introduce kids to Tintin as opposed to introducing adults to Tintin.
That's a really good question. Um,
The reason for
I
that,
think.
I'll preface it by saying that, for example, The Black Island was a book that as a kid I loved, and I think it's
Mm,
great for kids because of the tension and the rhythm and everything. But it's one that I tend to read less as an adult, and for example, something a little bit more complex like Calculus Affair or Castafiore Emerald, I tend to read more as an adult.
yeah, I would. It's a really good question. I mean, in terms of for children, probably stick away from Castafiore Emerald.
Yes.
Just because that relies on
I didn't read it a
your
lot as a kid, I must admit.
well, that's the same because I'm like he's not shooting anyone, he's not punching anyone. It's only when you get mature and realize the limitation he set to, like, oh, localize it entirely within one location, you appreciate like how like what an expert he was. In terms of, I mean, explorers on the moon, very, kids love space, it's a great adventure, but it is quite wordy at a lot of times, which is because he put the time in to work out theoretically how these physics could work. um Look, I'd say generally avoid the first three, avoid Soviets, Congo, and America.
Mm.
Political correctness aside, and antiquated representations aside, he just didn't have the pacing right. It was very, he was still learning as he went. So probably stick away from those three. I think they're more, you can appreciate them as part of a process, but not in overall works. But besides that, just look at the covers, see what you like, and dive in. There's such a variety there. You can there's going to be something for everybody.
Well, final question, Alex, because you're starting the day over there on a Thursday morning, and I need to let you go. I could keep talking to you for a long time because it's been really interesting. And but you know, I have a friend who lives in Barcelona, and uh, he told me several times that he decided to um, go into a specific kind of line of work because of the fact that he read um, Destination Moon and Explorers on the Moon. And he's an engineer because of that. And so I was wondering if, in your case, Alex, if Tintin has in any way had a meaningful impact on any aspect of your life.
Yes. but it is that, I have heard that as well. I wanted to explore space. I wanted to go traveling. I wanted to see, Peru.
In my case, I
Because
wanted to learn French because
there you go.
of
There you
Tintin.
go. For me, it really is just, you know, I I don't think I'm an artist, but I think I am a very creative person, and I love to make things, and just, I guess, learn appreciating Hergé artistically, not just visually artistically. I'm not a very visually mind. I don't do any visual art or anything. I can't really draw or anything, but just his pacing and his stories, and I guess his dedication to a story, his ability to pace it out, and his willingness to explore such a variety of different adventures and different settings. Even Castafiore Emerald, as we were talking about, having the confidence to say, I'm going to limit myself to an adventure set in one location. I'm going to make it entertaining and interesting. I think that's really something to be admired. His output really did slow after the Second World War. That we could have had double the amount of Tintin albums, but they wouldn't be of the same quality. It's because he did care so much about what he was making, and perhaps that's what I've internalized when with my slow podcast schedule. It's it might not be as quick, but you put in the time and you put in the effort, and you make something that will stand the test of time because you took the time to put your passion into it. So artistically and creatively, I think the series as a whole has been a big inspiration on me.
Absolutely. I agree with what you say about the podcast because it took me years to complete my series of videos in Spanish about all the episodes and all the albums and so it's not really a bad sign that it's taking you a while because it means that you're diving deeply into it and that you're doing something of quality and I really enjoyed it and that's the reason why I decided to get in touch with you and I appreciate you having spent some time chatting about Tintin and Hergé. And I want to give you the chance to very briefly explain what you offer on Radio Tintin and also where our listeners could, listen or access your show.
Yeah, so best place, it's available on all podcasting platforms and Spotify, just Radio Tintin. That's what you can search. I'm also on Instagram, Tintin.podcast. Tintin.podcast is the Instagram name, and posting a lot of the supplementary material that I come across in my studies and my research. That's the best place to find me. Drop me a line. Let me know what you think about Tintin. It's just been a fantastic opportunity to just talk to people from all over the world about their love for the series, and appreciating that there are other fans out there. So have a listen, give me a follow, and hope you continue to enjoy the podcast.
And Instagram is a way to get in touch with you because that's the way that we connected.
That's right. Yes.
All right. Well, I definitely recommend that everybody out there check out Radio Tintin. And our guest has been Alex Gates, who has been hosting for several years now the podcast slash chronicle slash project Radio Tintin. Alex, it has been a pleasure. I wish you all the best with this project and any other artistic and non-artistic projects that you're working on. And if at any point you want to come back, just let me know and we'll have another conversation like this on my Tintin and Hergé podcast. It has been truly a pleasure. And well, I hope you have a great rest of your day down under.
Thanks so much, Anton. Thank you for having me on. It's been a pleasure to chat Tintin with you. And well, you have a good night's sleep.
And for everybody out there, if they have any questions, any comments, they can leave them under the video in the part reserved for comments, and we will be happy to engage in conversation about Tintin, Hergé, and some related matters and topics. And check out Radio Tintin. That's the bottom line. And thanks everybody for listening. My name is Anton Garcia Fernandez, signing off now from the state of Tennessee here in the United States of America. Thank you, Alex, and so long, everybody.